Perfectionism often begins as a quiet survival strategy long before a person has a language to describe it. Beneath the surface is a persistent fear that something inside is fundamentally flawed, not quite enough to deserve acceptance, belonging, or love. What most people understand as being a perfectionist is less about high standards and more about a deeply ingrained way of navigating life. It is an attempt to outrun the shame of inadequacy by appearing flawless in behavior, performance, and presentation. Perfectionism tries to solve an emotional wound through achievement, but the wound rarely responds to achievement. What makes perfectionism so powerful is that it acts like a shield. If the child learns, implicitly or explicitly, that love, safety, or approval comes only when they behave flawlessly, they begin constructing a self built on performance. They start believing that mistakes threaten relationships. They start believing that imperfection equals rejection. This belief system doesn't form logically. It forms emotionally. Children don't sit down and analyze their upbringing. They feel patterns of attunement or misattunement. They sense the distance. And from that sensing, they build a survival strategy called Be Perfect. When caregivers aren't responsive to a child's emotional needs, whether from stress, distraction, misunderstanding, or their own wounds, the child experiences an internal split. They don't conclude, "My parents are overwhelmed." They conclude, "Something is wrong with me." This early attachment misattunement becomes the blueprint for the child's relationship with themselves. They learn that authenticity is risky. They learn that vulnerability is unsafe. They learn that being seen as they truly are may result in emotional abandonment. So, they begin constructing a version of themselves they hope will finally be acceptable. For many children, perfectionism is incredibly adaptive at first. It helps them feel more in control. It allows them to earn small pockets of praise, affection, or at least the absence of criticism. It feels like an elegant solution. Hide the flaws, hide the messiness, hide the needs, hide the pain. Become impressive enough, capable enough, disciplined enough, silent enough, or helpful enough, and perhaps the world will finally meet you with warmth. To a child, this logic feels solid. It feels like safety. Over time, it becomes personality. As these perfectionistic tendencies deepen, they evolve from behaviors into identity. Somewhere along the way, the person stops performing perfectionism and begins to embody it. They no longer think, "I must do well." They think, "If I don't do well, I am nothing." The fear of inadequacy becomes the engine behind every accomplishment. They don't reach for excellence out of joy or curiosity. They reach for it to prevent shame. Their standards climb higher. Their tolerance for mistakes collapses. Their internal critic grows sharper, louder, and more persistent. Life inside a perfectionist's mind is often brutal. The inner dialogue becomes a relentless commentary of what should have been done better. Even small mistakes are magnified into moral failures. The tone is harsh, cutting, unforgiving. It resembles an abusive relationship. But the abuser lives inside the mind. The person speaks to themselves in ways they would never speak to someone they love. Their self-talk is a constant evaluation, a constant policing, a constant fear that one wrong move will expose their unworthiness to the world. This internal pressure doesn't operate only before performance. It continues long after. A perfectionist replays conversations, analyzing every word. They examine their expressions, reactions, and timing. They imagine how others perceive them and typically assume the worst. They believe they came off foolish, inadequate, or disappointing. This constant post-event analysis becomes exhausting. Their mind rarely rests. Even neutral moments are scrutinized for imperfections. This self-interrogation becomes a soundtrack of their daily life, feeding anxiety, shame, and emotional exhaustion. One of the great confusions arises when people try to distinguish healthy striving from perfectionism. High achievers are often mislabeled as perfectionists when, in reality, they're driven by curiosity, passion, or ambition. Healthy striving is about expansion. Perfectionism is about repair. Healthy striving says, "I want to grow." Perfectionism says, "I must fix what is broken in me." Healthy striving tolerates mistakes. Perfectionism fears them. Healthy striving celebrates progress. Perfectionism sees only what's missing. These two mindsets can look similar from the outside, but internally, They could not be more different. Many perfectionists feel deeply fused with their achievements. They don't simply perform tasks. They believe the tasks reflect their value as a human being. When they succeed, they feel momentarily safe. When they fail, they feel fundamentally flawed. This fusion makes every performance high stakes. A poor presentation becomes evidence of personal inadequacy. A small mistake becomes confirmation of inner defectiveness. There is no separation between the self and the outcome. This lack of separation makes life feel like an endless evaluation with no intermission. Even high achievers struggle with this identity fusion. Olympians, artists, executives, surgeons, people who seem confident and accomplished may still carry a private belief that they are not enough. They perform extraordinary feats, yet internally feel ordinary or defective. They distinguish between their public persona and their private self, often feeling disconnected from their accomplishments. They may think, people admire what I do, not who I am. This disconnect prevents success from ever soothing the underlying wound. One of the most devastating realizations for perfectionists is that achievement does not heal the feeling of inadequacy. Success doesn't sink in. Praise doesn't register. Wins feel temporary, unsatisfying, or fraudulent. The perfectionist believes that if they could just reach a higher level, another degree, promotion, title, award, then the emptiness might finally disappear. But the emptiness is not performance-based. It is identity-based. No amount of achievement can fill a wound created by emotional unmet needs. Failure, however, does the opposite of success. It reinforces a belief of unworthiness. Even small setbacks become symbolic. They think, I knew it. I'm not enough. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle. Success never satisfies, and failure always confirms a core fear. The internal logic becomes distorted. Achievements are minimized, reframed, or dismissed. Failures are amplified and internalized. The perfectionist becomes trapped in a psychological loop where nothing they do can prove their worthiness, yet everything they do can disprove it. This dynamic makes the perfectionist's life feel like a treadmill that speeds up with every accomplishment. The more they succeed, the more the bar rises. What once seemed like an impressive goal now feels inadequate. A completed task is immediately overshadowed by the next. Instead of satisfaction, there is relief. Instead of joy, there is pressure. Instead of rest, there is anticipation of the next challenge. The future becomes a long list of obligations, and the present becomes a place they rarely inhabit. Perfectionism also shapes the way people interpret suffering. Some perfectionists believe that effort must feel painful to be valid. If something comes easily, they devalue the outcome. They believe that real success requires struggle. Others interpret effort as evidence of inadequacy, believing that if they were truly capable, they wouldn't need to try so hard. These contradictory beliefs reveal how individualized perfectionism becomes. Two perfectionists might behave similarly, but interpret their efforts in completely opposite ways. Despite these differences, perfectionism tends to cluster into three main psychological orientations. One orientation is self-directed, the belief that I must be perfect. Another orientation is outwardly directed, the belief that you must be perfect, often projected onto partners, colleagues, or children. The third orientation is socially prescribed, the belief that others expect me to be perfect, which creates crushing external pressure. These orientations often overlap, intertwine, and reinforce each other, shaping how a person navigates relationships, responsibilities, and self-worth. The socially prescribed dimension is particularly painful because it creates a constant fear of disappointing others. The person assumes that people are judging them harshly, expecting impossible standards. This belief doesn't require evidence. It grows from early experiences of conditional acceptance. Even neutral feedback can feel threatening. A raised eyebrow, a pause, or a question may be interpreted as criticism. Living under the imagined scrutiny of others becomes a suffocating experience that amplifies anxiety and self-doubt. When perfectionism extends outward, relationships become challenging. The person who believes others must be perfect often carries the same fear of inadequacy they impose. Their high expectations are usually a projection of their own internal pressure. They may criticize, control, or micromanage not out of malice but out of fear. Their intolerance of imperfection in others mirrors their intolerance of imperfection in themselves. This can create tension, distance, and conflict in relationships, even though the underlying driver is usually fear rather than superiority. The self-oriented dimension is often the quietest yet most destructive. It is a relentless internal demand performed flawlessly and the inability to rest without guilt. It is waking up every day feeling behind, feeling like there is more to prove, more to fix, more to achieve. It is a belief that worth is always conditional. This dimension often remains invisible to others because perfectionists present as competent and composed. Yet internally, they live with constant pressure, fear, and emotional fatigue. Over time, perfectionism drains the capacity for joy, spontaneity, and self-compassion. Life becomes a series of tasks to be executed rather than experiences to be lived. The person loses connection to their authentic desires, values, and vulnerabilities. They begin to mistake control for safety, productivity for worthiness, and validation for love. The tragedy of perfectionism is that it begins as a strategy to avoid pain, but eventually becomes a source of ongoing suffering. Healing begins not with lowering standards, but with shifting the underlying belief about self-worth. It requires recognizing that worth is inherent, not earned. It requires learning to tolerate mistakes without labeling them as moral failures. It requires reconnecting with emotions, needs, and parts of oneself that were abandoned long ago. Healing perfectionism is less about changing behavior and more about changing the relationship with oneself. It is a process of reclaiming humanity from the illusion of flawlessness.